which they will be speaking. Each of the people on the panel tonight will speak for about 10 minutes or so. Then there'll be time for discussion, and then we'll give it back to the people up here if they want to make any closing comments or respond to any questions that have come up. So, first of all, I wanted to let people know that Gabrielle Nadeau-Dubois, who was going to be our speaker tonight, who is the former spokesperson for CLAS and a leading activist in the Quebec student strike, sends his regrets, is not able to be here tonight, but he has asked Ludwig Moquin-Baudry, who hopefully is on the line with us, who's a longtime activist in Quebec Solidaire, also in the student movement, and who was the former press secretary, elected as the press secretary, and on the executive council of CLAS as well. Our second speaker will be Ron Plain, who's over on my right. He's a member of the Ongunan First Nation, who has helped his people wage a 30-year struggle against the damaging effects of oil industry pollution. He's faced and is facing attacks currently from CN Rail for his role in an Idle No More blockade. Our third speaker will be Andrea Babington. She's the Vice President of the Toronto and York Region Labour Council and a member of Unite Here Local 75. Andrea has been defending the rights of workers in Toronto's hotel industry, where she's worked for more than 17 years. Our final speaker will be Carolyn Egan, who is the President of Steelworkers Area Council, a pro-choice activist, and a leading member of the International Socialists. So again, to everyone, thanks for coming out tonight. And with no further ado, I guess we'll start out with Ludwig from Montreal.
Yes, the 2012 student strike has already made history as the largest social movement Canada has known in the past decades, seeing the largest demonstrations in Canadian history. You need no further introduction, so I'll cut to the chase. That is, how we bridged the gap between an apparently corporatist fight against a tuition hike and the broader fight against neoliberalism, and how we made it possible. Since the quiet revolution of the 1960s, there have been about 8 general strikes in Quebec. What I mean by general strike is the complete shutdown of university departments, faculties, and campuses, as well as CEGEP campuses across the province. That history of struggle accounts for the low tuition in the province. Well, low according to North American standards. Quebec is still above the OECD countries' average, by the way. Also, student unions, ISIS unions, not fringe or affinity groups, have been a school for Quebec activists for quite some time now, which partly explains the vitality of other social movements in the province. So the 2012 strikes. Like other strikes before, it started on the basis of a fight against a single tuition hike. But this time, it was coupled with a fight against austerity that can, at least partly, explain the scale the movement took this time around. It all started in 2010, when then Finance Minister Raymond Bachand announced a cultural revolution in the public services. What he meant by that was a transition from universal state-funded public services to a user-payer model. Since they had got to power in 2003, the Charest Liberals had repeatedly lowered taxes for corporations and high-income individuals, and in the wake of the 2008 crisis, suddenly found themselves with a large deficit. But of course, instead of reverting to the previous fiscal model, they preferred cutting budgets and making people pay. You know the story, it's the same everywhere. And education was not spared. Tuition would increase by 75% between 2012 and 2017. So to fight off this attack on the public good, a coalition was formed. The Coalition contre la tarification et la privatisation des services publics, or Coalition Main Rouge, the Red Hand Coalition. It gathers all kinds of community groups, student unions, labor and trade unions, environmental organizations, and so on, under one umbrella and with a shared set of demands. Our general strategy for the student strike was to ask for cancellation of the hike in the perspective of abolishing all tuition fees. While only part of the movement, that represented by CLAS, talked about free tuition and widened the discourse to other issues. But yes, It was part of a larger reflection on the role of education in our society, its value, and the principles that should be guiding the institution. This was summed up in our position against the commodification of education. It helped radicalize the movement by showing that the attack against education is part of a broader neoliberal agenda that affects all of society. Commodification of nature, commodification of public services, commodification of people. By fighting against the tuition hike, we were fighting against the system. This was pretty clear to everyone when the repression started. The fight against tuition was our entry point, the breach that led into a broader fight against austerity politics. You need one issue at the start. Only after can you link all other issues to it and to a more general principle, say neoliberalism. And maybe after that, a second front is possible. That's what we began to see with the Earth Day demonstration of April 22nd and the fight against Law 12, better known as Bill 78. And it did help radicalize the movement, which would never have lasted if there hadn't been a deeper demand than that of canceling the hike. Moreover, this has helped rehabilitate the ideas that had seemed radical for some time, such as free tuition. We have never spoken more about free post-secondary education in Quebec since the early 1980s. We have resurrected a dream that was shared by a majority of Quebecers in the 1960s and 70s. And only by saying such a thing, we demonstrate how far to the right society has moved since then. So the main locus of the strike movement were the General Assemblies of local student unions. General Assemblies have been part of Quebec student politics for a long time now, and the movement prides itself with its democratic structure, especially at AC and class. The most important decisions are made at that level, and this has many consequences. First, this allows people to grasp directly what's at stake. Direct democracy is a way of diffusing information, which leads to a better understanding of the issues, and knowing that their decision is sovereign, a deeper engagement with the democratic process. In a nutshell, that's what we call empowerment. Moreover, people know that the crucial calls will not be made by an elite behind closed doors, so that they trust the process and feel engaged. Second, because direct democracy demands frequent GAs, the decision process is sometimes not as fast as some people could expect. The members need time to get the information, time to think about it, time to debate the various options, and then time to take the decisions. So yes, it's quite heavy, and it disrupts what I would call capitalist temporality, which constantly demands us to go faster, be more efficient, meet the expectations of productivity, and to which the media are subordinated as well. And it would sometimes drive them mad when it took us a whole week to take a crucial decision. In other words, the temporality of democracy is incompatible with capitalism, and to acknowledge that fact and take that time is, nowadays, an act of resistance. The 2012 student strike was the most polarizing event to happen in Quebec since the 1995 referendum. It was a constant matter of debate among friends, families, colleagues, etc. Some friendships were broken over that matter, some families were split between supporters and opposers of the strike. For the first time in decades, there was a real left versus right debate. You have to understand that until recently, the main dividing line in Quebec politics was the national question. At the same time, there was a sense of national difference that emerged among large segments of the Quebec youth. We are the only ones who have fought against tuition hikes, and we strive for a different model for our universities than that of the US or English Canada. So while this was not a nationalist movement, there were at times some undertones. Another very important issue was our relationship with the labor movement. Of course, we were natural allies in our struggle against the government's austerity politics. We have taken part in their demonstrations and they took part in ours. But the true issue was that of the length they would go to in order to show their support. I could not tell the whole story tonight, but I would stress one aspect: the divide between union leadership, who tried to preserve the union's status as serious players, in other words, corporatist interests, while showing support, and the base. This was especially true for the teachers, professors, and lecturers union, where groups like Prof contre la hausse, Profs Against the Hike, made up of the union members dissatisfied with leadership, were formed to take part more directly in the day-to-day actions. In the public sector unions, there was another shock as well. A bunch of kids managed to do what they had never done in a very long time, that is, to put the government on the defensive. Even the president of the FTQ, Quebec's equivalent of the CLC, acknowledged that we had taught them a lesson. Even though we folded back on all reflexes when unions across Canada started sending money to class, asking them to hold back and respect the autonomy of Quebec unions. That was a bullshit excuse. The true reason behind this is because they knew that elections were coming and they did not want the students to disturb their agenda. But in the end, no true harm was done. We had enough money to keep on going, and they did their stuff during the election. Another thing that changed in the general climate is the trust in the police and institutions of power. A lot of people, especially young people, have seen the darker side of capitalist state repression, which they had never experienced before. Of course, the police violence was intense, something like the G20, but spread over 6 months, with mass arrests of 500 people at a time, and so on. But for the first time, the whole judiciary system was mobilized to break the strike, with court injunctions. And it is the failure of these injunctions that led to the passing of Bill 78. But the days before that, in early May 2012, were the worst days of the whole strike. Scenes of siege on campuses, fights between strikers and students who demanded those injunctions, and so on. Seeing this from the inside, one rapidly loses faith in the institutions which are supposed to protect us. I know people who were pacifist social democrats at the beginning that turned into radical communists over the course of the strike, because they had seen that the liberal order entails state repression and is thus contradictory with its own claims. We knew that our fight was not only against tuition hike. Well, I say we, but what I mean is the left wing of the movement represented by class. The student federations have historically considered themselves more as lobby groups than unions, than parts of a broader social movement. The last time, in 2005, they had succeeded in keeping control of the agenda and negotiations, and effectively ended the strike with a cheap agreement with the government. But this time around, the global political context was more in favor of a more critical, radical movement. In other words, class achieved hegemony over both agenda and discourse. No deal could be struck without us. We almost became fashionable. And our discourse was one of junction with other struggles, because we had a common enemy, neoliberalism. So we brought our mobilizing forces to support those struggles, which in turn created a movement of solidarity for our own. And with the passing of Bill 78, the Castrol demonstrations in some places were succeeded by regular weekly popular assemblies in some parts of Montreal, as well as cities of all sizes across the province. The manifesto we published in early July of last year, and the Quebec tour we made in July and August, had a very specific mission: to develop our message and to show the connections between the different problems society faces, and more importantly, to bring it directly to the people all over the province, bypassing the media filter. At the same time, as our tour drew a lot of media attention, it allowed us to help publicize the independent and popular assemblies we were paying visit to. And I would not underestimate the importance of such an exercise for the people who attended those meetings, as well as for the students who took part in the tour. Because the conflict was mostly concentrated in Montreal and Quebec City, people elsewhere had only an abstract, one-dimensional vision of the conflict. Direct communication allowed them to acquire a deeper and thicker understanding of the struggle. On the other hand, on the student side, it was important to see that people who don't live the everyday of the strike don't have the same conception of it, and that you need to reach out to those people if you want to create a genuine, broad social movement. Yes, it was all about reaching out. And this is what we were doing from the beginning. Reach out to students in their daily lives to explain what's at stake. Reaching out to other movements to build a strong coalition. And reaching out to the population. And now it's about reaching out to movements elsewhere and to share our experience and lessons with other movements. And for the sake of progress and struggles everywhere, and in the name of what is possible. Thank you.
I love preaching to the choir. I'm here today and I'm here tomorrow, and I'm talking about two different things. So I'm going to try to separate the two different things. And I think what's important tonight is what's going on with CN and the whole issue around how they're using that, or using me as the scapegoat. But I can't talk about CN without going back at least a dozen years. A company called Imperial Oil had what they called a catalyst release. And Imperial is one of our 63 neighbors. A catalyst release is a release that is kind of like a hodgepodge of contaminants. And we average 96 of these things a year, so to have a release or an accident is sort of commonplace, and it has to be extremely out of the ordinary to catch attention. This one caught attention because Imperial showed up at my house, or they had contractors show up at my house, and they cleaned my car inside and out. They power washed my house, they cleaned my windows, they cleaned my furniture, they cleaned my carpets. They cleaned my ductwork and they cleaned my furnace. So it stood out. And about a week later, they stood in front of our community, much like this right here. We had Imperial's people on one side and our chief and council on the other side. And the Imperial expert was standing up and telling us not to worry, that this contaminant didn't harm our lungs. Now they're cleaning my furnace filter, but it didn't harm my lungs. And I stood up because I tend to be mouthy, and I said to my chief and council, where's our experts to either agree with these people or refute what they're saying? And my chief and council said they're coming, and they never did. A little while later, during that meeting, Imperial offered everybody in the community a form to sign, and if you signed that form, they gave you a check for $300. Now, my community is completely surrounded by Chemical Valley. There are thousands of jobs in Chemical Valley, and we argue whether it's 3 or 5 of our band members actually work in the valley. So we are as poor as the most northern reserves. The fact that we're surrounded by a city doesn't make us a job. And $300 is $300, and when you've got to put bread on the table, many people sign that paper. And I stood up again and I said to our chief and council, I said, where's our attorneys to tell us if this is a good thing to sign or it's not a good thing to sign? And they said that they're coming. They never did. Now, I don't want to say that anything nefarious is happening within my chief and council. We are as blind to the world as your leadership, in that we equate success with money. The more you have, the more successful you are, and therefore we'll elect you into office. And the only people who had success in our community were people who had been fortunate enough to be one of those many few who got a job in Chemical Valley. When you work in an industry for 30 years, 40 years, you begin to buy the propaganda that they throw at you. The company's got your back. And we, as residents of Canada, or even North America for that matter, firmly believe in our governments. Harper's done a lot to put chinks in that lately, but we believe as people that if there was something that bad, the government would do something about it. They have our back. So I don't want to say that our chief and council had done anything wrong other than buy the propaganda. That began our career as activists within our own community. I've been doing activism since the early 60s. Yes, I'm that old. But to tell me that it's not harmful to my lungs, or to my children's lungs, or to the animals that are outside who I can't speak for, I thought was just an absolute bold-face. And later I was told, no, it was entirely accurate. The particulate that was released from Imperial was so fine, it went through the pores of your lungs, into your blood system, and every single cardiovascular issue from that day to today can be directly attributed to that Imperial Oil catalyst release to some degree. So by signing that waiver, we waived that. That began the Aamjiwnaang Environment Committee. That was a group of us who got together. We were just really pissed off citizens. And we began to open our eyes to those 63 companies that surrounded us. And they are the who's who. We have the richest, most powerful corporations on the planet as my next door neighbors. Now, I'm going to assume that we are all very similar people in that, let's say we went to the variety store just now, it's a hot night, we grab ourselves a cold treat, and as we're going to throw that wrapper in the garbage bin, the wind catches it and blows it across the street. It's now not safe for me to run out and grab that wrapper, so I walk away feeling very guilty that I just littered. Does that sound like you? I think it is, you know, like I think we're all very similar creatures. Now, multiply that by 1,000,000, and you'll begin to get the tiniest of understanding what it's like driving onto my reserve. 63 of the richest, most powerful corporations in the world made my reserve the most polluted spot in North America. National Geographic told me that. The World Health Organization said we have the most contaminated airshed. They've never used the term airshed before in Canada. That's the World Health Organization. These are two big, credible organizations stating something that you don't know about and you live 3 hours away. Anybody here been to Mexico? When you're landing in Guadalajara, it looks like you're going to skip off the pollution because the air's so brown. I asked the guy, I said, qualify this. How can you say that we are the most polluted spot? I've been to Mexico. I've toured that area. He says, because you don't see it doesn't make it less harmful. Well, in Chemical Valley, especially when you live there, you become so immune to those smells that they just become commonplace. And for those who ever want to come down, get in touch with Jesse. I'll take you for what we call the toxic tour. I won't do big groups, I'll do little groups. I've taken movie stars, rock stars, politicians, every scope of life on these toxic tours, and every one of those people are my resource people now. So when I need a toxicologist, I know who to call because I took them on a toxic tour. That's why I want to take you on a toxic tour. Every one of you has something that's going to help us in this fight. Anyway, so from that point forward, we had a collective group of people in Aamjiwnaang that were now conscious to what was happening to us. I don't know why we were blind before that, but there's the Epiphany Day. And as we moved along and we got a little bit of notoriety, Suncor announced in the newspaper that it was building Canada's largest ethanol plant directly across the road from where our daycare is and where the band office is and where the resource center where we have education programs for those who dropped out of school, and our church is right there, and there's residents right there, literally right across the street. They were going to build Canada's largest ethanol plant, and that's what they considered consultation, was putting it in the paper and telling us. And the government was going to contribute $20 million for this project. And I looked over at my cousin Wilson and I said, you know, the plants are doing a shutdown this weekend. The shutdown is where they close down a big portion of the plant, they do retrofits or maintenance or whatever they're doing. They use our roads, they're Aamjiwnaang's roads, they're like your driveway. We build them, we maintain them. They use our roads to get their heavy equipment in. So I looked at my cousin Wilson and I said, let's just go block the road. And we did. And 8 o'clock on, it was the Easter weekend, it was minus 35 or something like that. We pulled our cars up and we blocked it so you couldn't get through. And the workers came up and they tried to get through and they couldn't get through. And within a half an hour, the cops showed up. And I really wish that there was video cameras there for this, because this is one of the great stories of my life. The cop came up to me and in his best authoritative voice, so what do you think you're doing? I said, I'm blocking the road. You can't do that. Well, no, as a matter of fact, I can. And he didn't know how to respond because he knew he was on Indian land, not his. So he left. And we kind of celebrated a little bit, and then he came back with my chief and one of the councillors. And I think they were going to go like this and try to take me off the blockade. But I use an expression in my life, tapped by the Creator. That's when something happens, a whole series of events that you really can't explain. And as the chief and the councillor walked up to my cousin Wilson and myself, and we're all standing in a line and we're just ready to talk, is when the press took the picture. So it looked like my chief and that councillor supported this blockade, which brought out my whole community. So it went from being 3 people to the whole community. And that was the very first time somebody had ever taken a stand against Chemical Valley. That was the very first time. And it lasted 6.5 weeks. We cost them millions. The horror of being on a blockade is this. You get the whole community out when it starts. But 6.5 weeks later, you've got one guy sitting in a van who cannot sleep and nobody came to give him a break, and he's on there for 30, 35 hours. And he's got to be awake because he's got to get out of the van and open the gate so that the school buses and those having band business can get in and out, and the residents can get in and out. I'll tell you tomorrow what happened on that blockade, but the long and the short of it came to be, we won. We made our demands, we got our demands agreed to, and then we were sold out by our chief and council. Don't worry about it, the idiots will never get that blockade back up again because they knew the enthusiasm. A couple of years later, the Assembly of First Nations put a call out to all First Nations across Canada to take action. They said block railroad tracks. That was exactly what they said. And you all heard about the Sean Brand story in Tyendinaga. He went out and he blocked the main line that ran from Toronto through to Montreal, and they allowed him to block that line, him and others, for a 24-hour period. That very same time, we set our drum up, and we were drumming on the tracks that cross our community and go into Suncor. And this doesn't make the news because an hour and a half after we had the drums up, a federal injunction was issued to remove us from those tracks. You can block the busiest tracks in Canada, the Toronto-Montreal line, for 24 hours, unencumbered, but you block a set of tracks going into Suncor, and there's a federal injunction issued to take us off those tracks. So we were taking the drum apart, and the chief come up and he said, "What are you doing?" You know? So we told him, and he said, "Well, next time don't block here because they have a permit to cross here. They don't have a permit to cross on Williams Drive. The next time, block at Williams Drive." Skip ahead and skip ahead and skip ahead, and we come to the 21st of December. Now, Idle No More had taken off fairly strongly, and I'm proud to say that I was part of many of the events of Idle No More, from Ottawa to the blocking of 3 international bridges. And on the 21st of December, I was out of town, and we had sent 2 busloads of people down to Ottawa, our youth and some elders, to take part in the large Idle No More rally there. And my chief and another councillor, who are both cousins, went and blocked a set of tracks, and they said that we were going to block these tracks as a day, for a day in support of Chief Spence and in support of the Idle No More, but more so as an effort to bring attention to the horrific day that it was. If you all remember that day, it was like sleet and rain and ice, and the highways were a mess, and there was serious concern of all of those buses going into Ottawa. And our youth stood up and said, "No." Learning from the blockade on South Vital Street, we put it up, we make demands, we leave it up until our demands are met, and then we take it down. And the demands we had met were the exact same demands that Teresa Spence had, and that was the acknowledgement of the treaty infractions and a definite strategy with benchmarks to ensure that those treaty infractions are being addressed. And in our community, the treaty infractions are huge. I can't eat the fish, I can't hunt, I can't have a sweat because the rocks are contaminated, I can't use the cedar because the cedar's been found to have deadly levels of cadmium in it. We have the most polluted spot in the world, and we're the first human population on this planet to have what's called endocrine disruption, which is more girls than boys. So there's a lot of treaty infractions around the ability to live within our culture, within our community. On the 22nd of December, I found out about the blockade, and I went down there, and there was a half a dozen guys sitting around having a fire and talking. And they said, "Oh, by the way, a CN cop came and he dropped this off. It's an injunction that was issued at 10:35 on Friday night." And I said, "What the hell's a CN cop doing on my reserve? It's got no jurisdiction here." Does Walmart have a federally sanctioned police force?
Yes.
sanctioned police force. The connection between those two companies is they're both publicly traded companies. So is CN. How the hell does CN get a publicly sanctioned, federally recognized, the strongest jurisdiction in Canada? They can kick the RCMP off of their land. How do they get jurisdiction on my First Nation? So I read the injunction, and it says the injunction is for mile marker 239 of the St. Clair spur line, which is what it's called. And the spur line doesn't have any public service. It doesn't have a passenger train coming through, and it doesn't take product out to John and Jane Q Public. It services the petrochemical industry only. I read the injunction and I say, okay, well, if we have an injunction saying we can't be here, then we'll pick everything up and we'll go to the Williams Drive site and we'll put it down there, which nullifies the injunction. That means they have to go back to court and get a second injunction, but they don't. We have to keep the dates in mind, and I'm going to try to condense this as best I can at a time, but on the 21st of December, which was a Friday, at 6 o'clock at night, CN randomly selected a judge named David Brown here in Toronto. At 10:30, David Brown issued a lengthy ruling to grant what they call an ex parte injunction, meaning CN proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that it had the right to be there and that we were costing it harm by blocking those tracks. It said on the back of the injunction that if I wanted to appear, Amjinong, Chris Plain was the chief of Amjinong, it's the chief of Chris Plain and Amjinong, if they want Christmas Eve, how many lawyers worked on Christmas Eve? 25th was a holiday, 26th is a holiday, at 11 o'clock I have to be in University Avenue, not in Sarnia, but we have to be at University Avenue to appeal this injunction. And on the very last clause of the injunction, it says if we are going to appeal this injunction, we have to give CN 24 business hours. There isn't 24 business hours in that stretch of time. Miraculously, the next copy of this injunction states on it that we have to vacate not only mile 239 of the spur line, but the entirety of the spur line. They amended the injunction, which is illegal. Nobody showed up on the 27th of the month, or of December, so on the 28th, a new ruling is issued. CN shows up, and that video is all over YouTube, where I'm arguing with the CN cops on the tracks about serving us with an injunction. On January 1st at 3:30 in the afternoon, I received a Facebook message. I want to repeat that. I received a Facebook message from a lawyer from CN stating that I had to appear in court the next morning. That's illegal, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, I can see the stunned looks on your face. If I did not show up, I was going to jail. That is a legal service in this country. What if I didn't have an internet account? Yep. What if I didn't have a computer? It's a legal service. But I showed up. And I stood in front of the judge and I said, Your Honor, I'm here out of respect for your position, not theirs. They're making a mockery of this entire system. And I brought with me 3 big banker's boxes full of evidence that CN has no right to be on our property. They gave a verbal testimony to the judge saying that they had every right to be there, and he took that verbal testimony as gospel. I have Government of Canada documents that say that they're not allowed to be there, and he won't accept that as evidence, and he still today hasn't accepted that as evidence. He says if it's a land claim, then the powers that be have to file proper land claim. It's not a land claim, it's a title. We have title to this land. So we asked him in court, can I have a copy of the paper that you have that says you have a right to be there? I don't have the right to ask that in civil court. So I show up in court and I have this, and the judge says to me, Mr. Plain, CN has made a very generous offer. If you agree to contribute $5,000 to a charity of their choice, they will drop everything. And I said, no. The judge then said, if you choose not to take this very generous offer, I will find you in contempt, and you will pay $150,000 $180,000 to $200,000 for their legal fees. In other words, he just found me guilty without a hearing. At the end of the day, Mr. Plain, and the only other person charged in contempt is the Sarnia Chief of Police, because the Chief of Police and the Sarnia Police did not take down the blockade like they were instructed. There was something called the Ipwash Inquiry that gave a whole bunch of recommendations on how to deal with these types of incidences. And the Sarnia Police, the OPP, and the RCMP followed it to the letter. They came every night at 9:30 and brought us coffee. Every night at 9:30. We knew it was them because their van was missing a headlight. And it's freezing out, ladies and gentlemen. 100 people went down there. I'm very surprised because every time I come to Toronto, there's usually 3 or 4 people. I was there. Because it was a holiday, so we got people from all over. Anyways, it was cold. And the Sarnia Police were bringing us coffee. There's a video of a Sarnia police officer sitting at our drum on the tracks, drumming. But I'm charged with contempt of a court order for blocking the tracks. It's a very strategic decision to charge me. The courts have held for a long time that I cannot stand on a collective right. What that means is I can't claim a land claim. I can't claim an Aboriginal right because it's the leader of the community has to assert that, meaning our chief and council. But our chief and council are selected by the Indian Act, which is an act that is enacted by the colonists. So I can't say that it's a land claim. I can't say anything. Very, very strategically chosen. I was also charged civilly with contempt and not criminally. Now I have 11 lawyers that work with me on various things that I do within the court systems, and none of them could explain the difference between civil and criminal contempt. And there's a reason why that is, and this is why my case is so important today. Under criminal contempt, there's a finite penalty. They can get 45 days in jail. Under criminal contempt, they can fine me up to $10,000. Under civil contempt, I could walk out the building right now. CN could have gone to their judge and said to their judge, we fear Mr. Plain is encouraging these people to go block tracks, and they can hold me indefinitely. Guantanamo Bay type crap. My wife won't get a phone call. Nobody will know what happened to me. I just disappear into the penal system like a movie. Because I'm charged civilly. Civilly, they can fine me a ceilingless fine, millions upon millions of dollars. Now, CN stated in the New York Times that we cost them $65 million. You think they're going to try to go for that with me? They've already said that I'm going to be fined $180,000 to $200,000. They want my house. I'm the only person on the blockade from Anjouan who lives off the reserve. So I have the only house that's accessible to get. So by coming after me, they're saying to every native in Canada, this is what's going to happen to you. But much more than that, they're saying to you, we're going to scare you by how we treat Ron away from taking any actions. And what everybody is saying is going to be a summer of discontent. Not just for the Aboriginal people, but because John and Jane Q. Canadian are finally opening their eyes. It took this series of Harper-esque type of incidences to make mainstream media pay attention to what's going on in Ottawa. I have 3 unbelievable lawyers. The first lawyer who accepted my case is Chris Reed, and Chris Reed was the lawyer for KI. Y'all remember KI? I sang at a rally right here for KI. We were just talking about that, trying to figure out how long ago it was. What happened in KI was pretty simple. Plantniks went to one band member and said to that band member, you cannot stop us from doing exploratory drilling on your trap line. And the chief and council stood in front of that band member and they locked arms and said, you don't go after him, you go after us. My chief and council stepped back one step, locked arms and said, have Ron. And threw him under the bus, or the train as it were. When I asked why my chief and council were not being charged with contempt when they're named on the order, CN lawyers said, in an effort to maintain good working relationships with Angela, we've decided not to pursue. So the blockade had to come down. That was the moral of the story. It's January 2nd. The judge says, any way you slice it, whatever you want to say, tonight at 6 o'clock that blockade comes down, or you, and he points to me and the police chief, are going to jail indefinitely. I said, I don't run a blockade. I was asked by the community to be the spokesperson. And that doesn't make it my blockade. I came after the blockade was up. We were written about in a Chinese state paper in the Wall Street Journal on the same day. Our blockade became global news. It became kind of the poster blockade for I don't know more. And it scared them. It scared them a lot. So the blockade came down. We made a deal with the police. The chief of police was really cool about it. The deputy chief of police was pretty cool about it. He said, guys, take until 12. So we made a community celebration about it. We had a potluck dinner, and we had some musicians, and we had this and we had that, because it was a big success for our community. A sacred fire was lit on the 15th of December, and that went for some 77 days. Every day, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and people came clean around that fire. Guys who were hardcore users started going and hanging around the TV and hanging around the TV. Before you knew it, 2 weeks had gone past and they hadn't used. I mean, that's a big statement. So we celebrated that victory. And I went back to court on January 7th to say, okay, the blockade's down, this is all over. The chief of police is no longer there. He's not charged with contempt anymore because the blockade came down. And I am. And the judge said again that if I didn't take the offer for $5,000, that they were going to find me guilty and they were going to find me that fine. On the 24th of May, I went back to court, and that judge had recused himself because my lawyers had come forward. Chris Reed was the first lawyer. He was the lawyer that represented KI. Peter Rosenthal, who you might all know, has been involved in so many fights, is the lead lawyer, and Michael Leotul is third, rounding it all up. And we went to court on the 24th, and it was supposed to be the hearing date. What we ended up asking for was the evidence that CN had against me. And under civil law, they don't have to provide that to me. If I'm charged criminally, they have to give me everything in discovery, but under civil law, they don't have to provide me anything. What they're hiding is a corrupt judge. His name is David Brown. He was a former employee of CN. He was a former lawyer for CN, and he represented them at a hearing in New York. That's what they don't want released. If they have to provide us the information, and this becomes public fodder, but it's already broken on CBC, it's already broken on APTN, it's already broken on CTV. So the story's out there. He's the same judge that ruled against Sean Grant and Tyne. He's the same judge that ruled against the Occupy movement in St. James Park. This is what we're up against. So I'm going to wrap it up really quickly here. I have to put this out there because it's just the way it is. These guys are willing to work for me for whatever we raise. And we've been fundraising since January. And it's going to cost $40,000 to $50,000 to fight this right through to the appeals court, which we're going to end up. And I need your help. I need the help of everybody who can contribute whatever they can contribute, and I will make sure that the Lawyers Trust Fund is given so it can cut up a wall for you. I don't want your money. I don't want you to think we're going to Hawaii on your money. It can go right to the lawyer, right to the legal trust, and you know it's going to good cause. I hate to come and ask for things. I really do. I'm turtle and it goes against everything I am to ask for help. But my wife doesn't want to lose our family home. She puts up with me by doing this, so I don't want to lose my money. Thank you.
I think I can control these things. Okay. You want to break it? Okay, so first I just need to apologize. I missed a part of your discussion. And I was coming from Brampton in the rain and thinking I have to get here. So I fight through that, but it also gives me some time to think about what I want to say as well. And I just have to start out by saying, when I was thinking a bit about And you will find someone who know that it's a hard time but not sure what to call it. And this afternoon I was giving this lady a ride. And she said to me, which was weird because she didn't know I was coming in to talk about that. And she just said to me, I don't understand. Do you find around you that things are really hard? It's so different. I don't know what to say, what to put my finger on, but something is different. And I said to her, that's austerity. And she said, what do you mean? And I said to her, this is what's been happening for the last few years where you're going to work and you're finding it hard. She said, yeah, I find a lot of my coworkers are losing jobs. The jobs I'm doing is getting really hard. And I said, yeah, this is when our government and other governments all over the world decided that we need to give back more to our bosses. And I said, to be honest with you, this country is not a poor country. And your boss is not even poor either. We're just in a time where they want to take back. And, you know, she found that weird, but I found that really interesting because everyone, doesn't matter if we're in a labor movement and we put our finger on what's going on and our neighbors are there going through the same struggles and trying to figure out what's going on. But it's also, they also realize that this is going on for too long and they're not sure it's just them that's getting hurt and their coworkers. And so I remember last year I was here in this, I think it was the same room, again, talking a bit about the struggle that we face and also just to share about some of the things that the Labour Council, Toronto and York Region Labour Council, have been doing on the ground to tackle some of this. And I remember as well talking a bit about as we struggle and the way it was our mayor at that time who wanted to say to our community that it was union, why he was trying to cut their services. And also saying to them as well that if you're a union member, then you don't have a right to decent life or good jobs. And I was a bit disappointed because at the time when I spoke about that as well, I was just shocked that right in this country where leaders, president, prime minister, kings, minister of finance came here and said they were looking for a recovery plan, and they didn't. They just left and decided, let's blame the people and let's blame labor. And so that didn't stop. We fought and we got the community on side with us to fight to keep the services and also for us to fight to save some of those jobs. But I just have to say, when all that was happening, I did say it wasn't really a victory. We managed to put our foot, just the foot, between the door. It was just that crack. And sure enough, we find more and more somebody else will come along the way that decided, we're not going to do anything. We're just going to be elected and sit there and just blame union. And before Christmas, we got that news again when Mr. Harper decided to run through Bill 377. And so we got up for New Year's and also found out that Tim Hudak also announced that for his election platform, he also want again to take another crack at union. And I'm sharing this story because, again, related to what this lady asked, why are we going through this? This is not a union member, but it's just to explain that when politician comes out and say, all these things are happening and we're going to blame union, it's not affecting just union, it's what they do, it's affecting everyone. And Tim Hudak decided that he want to get elected, he want to put out there, and he's, again, why it's not important to have union power. And part of that he's saying, look, one, I want union members this time, because it's a number of us. I want union members to vote that they can just hop out of paying union dues. And people said, that sounds good, but why? And then he said, yeah, because there is something in the US called right to work. There's a slogan in the US that's called right to work. It's a legislation in 24 states in the US where they have right to work law. And in those states, lots of the jobs from Canada went there too. And the reason for that, because it's set up that those corporations are able to exploit those people that live in those states. It's set up that those people doesn't have much power to fight. Doesn't matter what you're going to bargain for, it's not a lot of strength there anymore. It's set up that it's just employer who have that right. And so Tim Hudak decided, let's get it across the border. And to do that, let's get our own union members to think about it. And it sounds good. We heard of the gravy train before, and then later we found out it wasn't the 1% that they were talking about. It was actually working class people. Now we're hearing right to work, and people go, okay, this makes sense. Maybe it's a guarantee of job, but it's really not. It's another person from the conservative government who decided we are going to lower people to say, I don't want to pay dues for a different reason. And we're going to say as well, we want to see all the finance. And he didn't just stop there. He decided as well that by you doing that, you're weakening the students' movement. None of that promised job. And that's what we're facing right now. And with that, the Labour Council again decided once more that we want to be able to face this. Because we can't run away from these issues. We've got to face them, and we've got to figure out again how do we come together when someone like this lady who's asking this question, there's no way that it's going to affect union members. And so we get a lot of feedback out there where some people go, yeah, it's about time. It's about time. When Tim Hudak said, by us weakening union, then we're freeing up space for a corporation. And the thing that bothered me about this man, the audacity of this man, every so often, he's in one of my immigrant community, kissing our babies, looking at our families and saying, I understand. You're an immigrant who have a vision. You're an immigrant who wants the best in life, and I'm here to give it to you. So now I have my neighbors meeting Mr. Hudak. But in the meantime, they don't know that they're never going to get these things that he's talking about. Because if he gets away with bringing in right-to-work legislation in this country, if you're hurt on the job, it doesn't matter if you're a union worker. He's saying, I want to chop that up so it's sent out there to any private guy. So you tell me, how can that help anyone? And how did he decide that this was an attacking union? If he's there in a community looking at someone's child and say, I'm here for a better future for this child, and then you walk away and say, let's get those students, how can that be? And in a time like this where we're here facing people who are losing jobs, some of those jobs already went to those right-to-work states. And then they sat somewhere and decided, let's make sure they don't get EI either. Then how can Tim Hudak become somebody's voice that anybody wants to listen to? How can that be the future? What that look like for Canadian? Again, we also are hearing, and it's a lot of actions happening out there when they're coming back saying to us that we want to bring in temporary foreign workers and also give permission to those employers to slash their wages 15%. Are those human beings? Are those people working hard enough? Like this lady said, 2 and 3 jobs, 2-3 people job. Why don't they have a right to decent pay? This is the things that he's rolling out. And again, a lot of what he's doing, this is not new. Women have been right at the front where they're running over. A lot of this, women feel the brunt of it. He's attacking us left, right, and center. And then it's worse again if you're an immigrant. That's even worse. We're looking at inequality in every sense of the way. And he's determined. Every so often a little bit of news go out here about it, and he's trying to get it seep into the community. He's getting it out there. And he's getting out there in fancy ways that people don't really feed it back to the workplace. And we have employers who are sitting out there and really happy. Because before Tim Hudak came out with this, let's go back. It's almost 3 years since the G20 here, when those leaders came here to put a recovery plan in place. And what they did since that for the 3 years, they went back to that think tank and decided, hey, we got it. Let's beat up on workers. Let's beat up on workers and blame them again. And this time he's bold enough to tell you that I want to take what you have and give it back to those big boss. You don't deserve it. And that's exactly what he's saying. And with that, Labour Council have a role to play. And I'm a leader in a union who also look at my co-workers on a daily basis and see that none of them, even for myself, when I go to work, I'm not looking handout. But I tell you, I want to know that somebody respect me, pay me what I deserve, and I want to know that when I land in this country, I didn't ask for handout. I want to know that somebody acknowledge that I want to get the same as the 1%. I'm not asking for the riches. All I'm saying, when I go out and I put in 8 hours, longer hours, some people are working without even getting paid for it. Some people are damaged at those jobs. And all we're saying, I deserve a better life. I'm not asking for yours. When I work, I need to know that you're recognizing that I have a right to have a better standard of living as well. And this is all a lot of our workers are saying. And a lot of our neighbors are wondering, what about them? What about them? And I think that the main message about this, that whatever Tim Hudak comes out, and the more we hear about it, and he says union, is for people to understand as well that this has nothing to do with union. It's about a party out there who decided that if I just call it union, I can get into all these communities and even damage it more. I can get in it and run over it. And then people struggle with the idea. Does that mean if we are already struggling for jobs and if this guy come in and people have this freedom to roam around, that help us? No, it don't. Because for him, asking people to give up their rights for union, it means those employers get to run over people at the bargaining table. And if I didn't have a union, I tell you, I wouldn't have any of that, because I cannot recall, even when a contract is up, a boss that walk up to any worker and say, gee, you've worked so hard for 3 or 4 years, I'm just going to give you your raise. They'll never do that. If anything, they spend many months fighting you for nickel and dime at that table. So why would anybody want to believe Tim Hudak when here he is telling you that this is about cooperation that needs space? What Tim Hudak is saying to us, really, he's saying, my vision, Tim Hudak's vision, to see a low-wage Canada, a Canada with people with low rights. That's all he wants. It's unbelievable that we get these leaders when whether it's mayors or whoever that seep out of the woodwork and all they want is to gut Canada. I thought they loved this country, but they don't. So it's always something more they want to see here. So I'm not sure what's going on. I think we need to start putting them down and doing some sort of, I wouldn't even say counseling. We need to go in depth, and look at what their vision, because I know my vision when I land here, what I want. And I think if I go to each of you, you'd say, what's your vision? And I think maybe this is time for these guys to tell us what is their vision. Because I think it's scary. They didn't come into power to do anything for prosperity. It's about tearing down people. So we decided as Labour that we also want to fight this back. It's not new to us. And so we want to fight this back by organizing our members, and we want to organize the community. And so Labour Council launched a campaign March 2nd. And we got a huge turnout where people came to that room and got educated about what was going on. And we are out there. Union are out there talking to their members, and we want to go further with that. But I think what is really important with this, and I won't deny that as well, that when they throw these things out, the same as the last election where people thought that gravy train was the 1% riding on it. And now they're saying, I actually voted. We want to use this opportunity to really embrace our members, because we are not perfect. And it's an opportunity for us to also talk to our members about who is the union, because they need to know if you give that right up, you're giving away yourself. You're not giving away the union office. And you don't give it away because you're upset about a grievance that wasn't heard. It's bigger than that. And so we want to use this opportunity to really get to know our members and get the members to know about themselves as well and know how much power they have right now. They don't need Timuda. And with the continuation of that is to also send that message to Timuda that while we're doing this, we want to continue fighting for stronger labor law. And yes, we're going to continue fighting for more union rights here in this country. We're going to do all of that. And again, to get members stepping up to the plate. Because we need to do that as union. There are unions that fight. You hear about all the victories out there, but a lot of this happens where members are at the bottom and they get the reward from it. So this is a time for us to get all of our members together and show Timuda that people don't just walk off to work and you go in their community and sell one goods and you go in the workplace and sell another. They are entitled to what they deserve out there, and they also can say to Timuda as well that if tomorrow I have to vote, I'll vote you out. And that's part of the work that we need to do right now. It's going to be a long road, but it's part of Labour Council work to make sure that as union that we go out there and do this whole union renewal. So I wanted to share that as well, because I know there's a lot of people out there who still wondering, what are we in this time? And what Timuda is doing is another segue to austerity. It's him continuing with the torch from one leader to the other to make sure that the 24 states in the US that have it, he too can say, look at what we've done to this province as well. So I just thank you for giving me the opportunity to
Our final speaker will be Carolyn Egan. Sorry, Carolyn.
Fly up to the podium here. Okay, thank you very much. It's sort of oddly placed. I don't know what the story is with it, but anyway, it's sort of unusual. It's like at your eyes. Right? All right. Well, thank you very much, Socialist Brothers, for coming out this evening. Come on, down a little bit lower. Yeah. All right. Okay. All right. It'll catch my voice, I think. All right. Cool. All right. Well, thank you very much for coming out this evening, and I'm going to follow on the theme that Andrea began about the austerity agenda. And I think it's no secret secret to anyone here that we're experiencing the longest economic crisis on record. World-renowned analysts like Richard Florida, if any of you read him, has said, you don't have to be a Marxist to wonder if capitalism has run its course. Don Tapscott, who's a Canadian business executive, a commentator, asked the question, is global capitalism fixable as a system? They and others recently took part in a symposium at the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto, just up the road here, entitled Where Capitalism Goes From Here. And as Andrea was just saying, what they're theorizing is being felt every day by working people and the poor. Governments and corporations around the world are launching massive attacks in the name of this austerity agenda. They tell us that their measures are necessary in order to keep governments from going bankrupt and to keep corporations competitive. But it's not simply a question of cost trimming, cutting deficits, or bringing budgets into line. They want to use this opportunity to fundamentally change the nature of our society and the role of the state. And why, as Andrea asked, should the working class and the poor, particularly women and those from racialized communities, pays the cost when we did absolutely nothing to cause the crisis? Why not clamp down on the businesses that are breaking the law, that Ron was talking about earlier, using financial loopholes, continuing to make profits and giving massive bonuses to upper management? Why not nationalize the banks and the corporations and bring the profits into the public realm? And the answer is that the attacks are not a pragmatic response to an economic crisis, as they tell us, but very much the implementation of an ideology intended to serve the wealthy. There's a massive transfer of wealth going on that's bringing increased suffering and dislocation to working people and the poor, not only here but around the world. And those that are inflicting this upon us are gambling that the anger from below that you hear it expressed today of this panel can be contained. And in this country, and we know it, a lot of workers remain caught between fear and anger. They want to fight back, they really want to fight back, but there's a pessimism. How can we do it? Can we do it and win? And the wealthy and the corporations, I think, because of the Hudak attempts around fighting unions and all, are afraid, they're very much afraid of the collective power of working people. But they want us to feel powerless, that it's not worth the fight because we can't win it. And people are fearful, just as we heard. They're fearful of what the future might bring, fearful for their jobs, fearful for their ability to make ends meet. And if you look back over the last 30 years, you see dramatic changes in the lives of ordinary Canadians. A lot of the old certainties have been swept away, a process that's very, very much accelerated by the economic crisis, and that there's a real fear of the precariousness of jobs, the instability in people's lives. And the immigrants, as Andrew was saying, come to this country with hopes of a better life. They face systemic racism. They face the growing gap between rich and poor. I mean, if you look just in the Greater Toronto area, we've lost over 100,000 manufacturing jobs in the last few years. And looking globally, I mean, there's 20% unemployment in the UK. There's now 27% unemployment in Spain, which has now caught up to Greece, which is the highest in all of Europe. And it speaks to the continuing crisis in the Eurozone. And we've seen the recent horror in Bangladesh, where over 1,000 workers lost their lives on the altar of business. And prosperity for those who work hard, that dream, if you look around, is in tatters, because we see governments rescuing the rich, and the polarization of social conditions and politics is likely to continue as more and more and more people become alienated from the political system because of what they're experiencing. Now, the austerity agenda that we're talking about is being implemented worldwide, and we're feeling it here in our own way. And of course, in response to any of this, the champions of neoliberalism, whether it's Harper, whether it's a liberal government here, whether it's social democratic governments in some places, they have one response: shrink the public programs, government by cutting, cut the services, privatize, sell public assets, and weaken any ability to regulate corporations at all, and shift the cost of the crisis from the corporations, from the wealthy, to working people and the poor. Cut the corporate taxes, increase user fees, withdraw from key areas of responsibility so people have to buy their services from privateers. And of course, reduce workers' wages, gutting labor laws where they can, weakening the unions, contracting out jobs, increasing precarious work, reducing employment standards. And we've seen the so-called right to work, as Andrew was talking about, being implemented, not in the states of the South only, but now the state of Michigan, which used to be the heart, was known to be the heart of the trade union movement in the United States. And anti-union legislation, as she said, is now the law in 24 states, and a milder form of this was just made law in Saskatchewan. There hasn't been a lot of talk about that, but it just happened. And they want to bring the open shop here. Why do they want to bring the open shop to Ontario? Under the guise of freedom of choice in the workplace? I mean, it's a joke. It's a real joke. And anyone who's ever been in an organizing drive know what that's all about. Things have been tougher and tougher and tougher since Harris, making it so hard for workers to organize in this province, and they want to make it even worse. And the intent, clearly, is to cripple the organized working class's ability to fight, because they know, and they know very well, that it is one of the strongest forces that stands between them and their goals. And that's what they're doing. And it's really important, as we discuss this, to contrast the treatment of working people who are losing their jobs, their homes, their unions, to the treatment of the culprits who are responsible for this financial meltdown that happened. I mean, we saw the federal government take away the right to strike from postal workers, rail workers, Air Canada workers. The Liberal government in Ontario taking away the right to collective bargain from the teachers while lowering corporate taxes. The temporary foreign worker program that was spoken of. It's exploitation at its worst, and it has to be stopped. And we can't allow ourselves to fall into this jingoism or just nationalism, only jobs for Canadians. If someone can work in this country, then they should pay the rate that is due them, and they should be given the path to Canadian citizenship. That is our goal. And we have to show the multinational, global capital that we will come after them the same way they are coming after us. They have gambled that the mass of people will accept the attacks, but we're seeing that this is not the case. And if you do look around the world, it's incredibly inspiring. If you look at Greece, Portugal, India, and even south of the border, in cities like Chicago, where the teachers fought back with the support of the students and the community, and they won against the city government that was intent on privatizing the schools into charter schools, making the conditions worse and worse for both the teachers and the students, growing class sizes. I met with 2 teachers from Chicago yesterday, and they talked about how they rebuilt their union in 3-5 years from the bottom up. And they are totally involved. They're in the vanguard in many senses of the progressive movement in that city, because they connected so closely with the communities and the students they serve. And you can see other examples in non-union workplaces in the US, like Walmart or McDonald's, where workers, students, the marginally employed have risen up and fought back with illegal walkouts. When they weren't allowed to unionize, and they took it into their own hands. And these are important examples of the anger that's there beneath the surface, and it's bursting out here and bursting out there. Now, obviously, the picture is not all rosy, and there have been real retreats, and there have been defeats. And who will win and who will lose is still an open question. But we know that we have the ability to push back these attacks, but only if we're organized to do so. And we've seen very tough fights here in Canada. Looking back last year, the Rio Tinto workers in Alma, Quebec, and there are people here who went to that struggle. You know, Michelle and Christine and Fred and Roop and others of us drove 13 hours one way to Alma, twice. We did come back. It was a long journey. But we had a busload of steelworkers from Toronto, another busload of steelworkers from Hamilton. And we were trying to give our support. Rio Tinto is the 3rd largest multinational corporation in the world. But 800 Quebecers from the very heart of Francophone Quebec, the Saguenay, they took them on. They built strong community support, and they knew they weren't alone. And I think the solidarity that was built between Anglophone and Francophone workers through that struggle was tremendously important. They organized they pushed their union, the Steelworkers Union, and they organized very strong support in the U.S. and Africa and Europe, Australia, and CAW workers out of the Rio Tinto facility in Kitimat, BC, were giving $60,000 a month from their own wages to support the locked out workers in Alma. And that's extraordinary. It's that kind of solidarity that we need whenever workers are on strike or are locked out. They cannot be allowed to feel they're alone. And $60,000 helps to keep food on the table and kids in clothes through that tough winter. And this is tremendously important. And what it does more than anything else is it gives confidence to workers that they're not alone. And if they're not alone, then they feel they have a chance at winning. And that confidence is what we have to instill. If you look here in Toronto, Porter Airline workers, young workers, you look at their faces and you see the diversity of this city. And they're making $12 and $14 an hour when they should be making double that. They are fueling the planes. They're keeping the planes in the air. But Porter does not want to give them the dignity of being in a union. Right now, I understand it's $60,000 a year that would make the difference. And Porter won't give it, not because of the money, because they don't want union. Now you look at New Brunswick, you look at Quebec, and the cutbacks in EI, they're felt everywhere, but they're mobilizing. In those two provinces, I believe it was over 50,000 marched recently through the streets of Montreal in a demonstration. We were just out, numbers of us here, last weekend at U.S. Steel in Nanticoke, Lake Erie Works. 1,000 workers locked out by U.S. Steel because they want a concessions contract one more time. They don't want the younger workers to have the same benefits, the same wages that their fathers had fought and their mothers had fought for and won. They're trying to take it away. They're trying to buy off the older workers, just like they did in Rio Tinto and Alma, and let the younger workers, grow up in a situation where they're not paid a decent wage and don't have decent benefits. These are tremendously important struggles. And I think when we were out there, we know there's an activist leadership. We know there's a hardcore rank-and-file grouping that is going up against U.S. Steel, 1,000 workers and retirees, a community that's organized behind them, and their fight is our fight, and we've got to give them all the support they need. Now, we've seen, and Andrea talked about the fight against HUDAC that's beginning to build in our workplaces from really the bottom up. And we know that's all happening. But in spite of these local fightbacks in this country, there's been no broad mobilizations that we have seen in other places, and that sometimes can be discouraging, but this could still come. And we've seen the massive fightbacks in other areas of the world, and Greece has been shaken by repeated general strikes, workplace occupations, mass protests. While the headlines have been dominated by the threat to the Eurozone, the attempt to shift the burden of the biggest economic and financial crisis of post-war capitalism onto workers' shoulders has now provoked in that country the highest level of struggle in Europe since the Portuguese Revolution in 1975. Today, Greece is presently at the center of a storm, and the moves by the Greek business elite, driven on by the European Bank, the IMF, to sharply force down workers' living standards is producing a major crisis. And all this is taking place, and we can't forget it. Looking at the revolutions of the Arab Spring a few years back in the Middle East, the global Occupy movement, as we talked about earlier, the 99%, and these things have inspired people around the globe. And we can see, if you look at the situation in Greece, that it is the working class at the center of the rebellion against austerity. And so many who proclaim that workers won't fight back, it's a pessimistic viewpoint, it's shown it's not, it's put a lie to that, absolutely a lie to that. And I think the role of precarious workers, immigrant workers, in that economy, and the fact that trade unions and others have reached out in such a way that they're part and parcel of that struggle and trying to fight against, the attempts by Golden Dawn and other right-wing, this is a neo-Nazi group, to try and bring people to the right. This is so, so important. But in Greece, it was pressure from below. It was groups of workers who pushed the leaders to fight, build the rank-and-file confidence, and organize to drive the struggle deeper and deeper. And the lessons from Greece are vital for all of those, and it's everyone in this room for sure, who want to oppose the austerity agenda and fight for a better world, and make sure that dissatisfaction does not go to a right-wing conclusion. And if you look in that country, you can see the popular movement really has shifted. The confidence of people to fight back against the vicious attacks, against the attacks on the jobs and living standards has grown, and it wasn't by accident. And the one thing that I think, many things, but one thing we have learned about what's happening in the fight against the austerity measures in Europe is that it is a process and not an event. I say this all the time. We've said it before, and it's so important. The capitalist crisis itself protracted. The level of fight back has to be seen on that long-term scale as well. And if you look back, when there was the announcement of the cutbacks in Greece, it didn't bring a big night of barricades. Nothing was automatic or just spontaneous. Social movements, any of us who've been in them know they don't proceed as a whole. It's a process of building at the base, with peaks and valleys, moments of surges forward, then retreats, and the same applies obviously to the workers' movement. There is unevenness. There's always going to be unevenness. And walkouts and rallies are often sparked by smaller groups. Ron here is an example of that, right? On your own reserve. We know that. Everyone has a role to play, and we want our actions to help inspire and build the confidence of those around us. And we know there's going to be an imbalance. We know that. That's part of the world we live in. But where there are numbers of people who are willing to take responsibility to organize and take action into their own hands, we see the leadership is pressured. If we have a leadership in the union movement or a community or reserve chief or anyone, they're pressured to do the same. And I think if we look at Greece, we've seen a constant effort by the most advanced, if you want to put it that way, militant sections of the workers' movement to help others move forward, to overcome impediments put up by some leaders who don't want to move, and provide examples of struggle that can inspire others into action. People need the confidence to act. Now the general strikes, and there have been so many, have brought hundreds of thousands in the streets, but before that there were smaller, more fragmented actions, and these created a very complex process within the working class and before that it was students who showed the way forward when the police killed a 15-year-old and people went into the streets. And during the process over these years, tens of thousands of people who were never active before were being drawn into the political arena. So we have to put our faith in the struggle and the ability of people to self-organize, to move with the times, and create the situations that mass struggle can grow from. People's ideas change and struggle. They do when they see themselves side by side with their fellows. And what may have seemed impossible days or weeks before suddenly seems very possible because of the growing confidence and the objective situation that any of us may be facing at one given time, and it brings people into a campaign and into struggle with us. So these are the things that are so important. And we don't know what the future will hold, but the situation, Greece, Bangladesh, India, China, remains incredibly volatile. And the ideological crisis that it creates, by the very volatility of the crisis, it shows huge opportunities for the fight for another world, a world that's governed in the interest of all people. And it's our role, clearly, to be deeply rooted in these struggles and to fight shoulder to shoulder with those around us. Because austerity does not have to be. It was politically chosen. We have to take on the arguments and look to the struggles we see erupting all around the world. And we have to demonstrate that there is a different way, that there is an alternative, that we can build the foundations of a better world. They are unwavering, those on the other side, and unbending, and we have to be the same. All those people who were inspired by the Arab Spring, inspired by the Occupy movement, inspired by the Quebec student movement, inspired by Idle No More, they are still there and they still want change. We have to connect wherever we may be with our fellow workers, fellow students, in our communities, the communities in which we live, bring people into struggle and push back against this agenda and continue the momentum forward. It's times like these, when you saw the devastation in Bangladesh, for example, that the system we live under shows itself in all its horror. That working people begin to look for very real alternatives to a system that's based on exploitation and oppression, pitting one against another for the sake of more and more profits. So we have to be in the thick of the battle, rooting ourselves in our workplaces, linking with with our communities and bringing forward alternatives which can point the way forward to society, which will hopefully stop the ruthless exploitation that we're seeing all around us. I mean, I've been in the struggle a long time, but this is a tremendously exciting period. Horrible attacks, but you see people rising up everywhere, and that's certainly what allows me to be inspired. So I believe there's a tremendous opportunity before us, and let's make sure we take advantage of it, sisters and brothers. Thank you.
Apologize to people because we do have a second part of the evening, which is a performance readings by Julie Devani, which I would encourage you to stick around for. It's a great book, and I've heard her read from it. So we're just going to have one special announcement, and then I'll just say a couple of words, and then so Jesse.
Great. So this session is called Solidarity Against Austerity, and a critical part